So, just to introduce myself, in addition to the earlier introduction, I was fortunate to work in Yahoo from 2005 to 2010 as one of the founding team members of the team that built Apache Hadoop. Later I worked at Greenplum, which was a division of EMC at that time, and later it was merged into a company called Pivotal, where I was a chief scientist until 2015. Most recently, as in starting last year, I've now founded my own company called Ampool, where we are working on in-memory data infrastructure. So I will be talking a little bit about that towards the end. But the agenda here is, since the topic is about emerging data architectures, so we'll first see, what happened before, only then we can see what is going to happen next. So looking back into the history of data platforms, how we came here, only then we can talk about what is probably going to happen next, right? So there is some stargazing going on there. All right. So I'll talk about the history of data platforms over the years, for the last 50 years, as I know it from the industry point of view. How did we come here, which is how did the relational database management system become such a pervasive force in the data infrastructure. We'll obviously talk about Hadoop and NoSQL. That's basically the history of the last 15 years. And then let's just briefly examine what the technology trends are. I mean, non-database technology trends that actually enable us to predict what is going to happen over the next several years, right? And then obviously I'm going to plug my own startup, my own product, which is called Ampool. And the reason that we started Ampool was basically we saw there was a huge gap in terms of how do we achieve these or architect these new platforms for the next generation data workloads, and that's how we got started. So I will talk a little bit about that, okay? So before 1975, I don't think most of you were born at that time. I mean, I was born, but I did not know what database was. I did not know what a computer was at that time, so that's fine. So before 1975, there existed something called CODASIL. It was Committee for Data System something, right? So what came out of CODASIL, actually there were two biggest achievements of CODASIL. CODASIL was actually started in 1956, much before I was born. And the two biggest achievements of CODASIL were, first was a language called COBOL. How many have heard of COBOL? How many have programmed in COBOL? All right, good. That shows your age, by the way. And the second thing that came up from CODASIL was really standardization of data platform, right? How does a business store and access its data that it needs, right? That standardization came out of CODASIL. This was around 1960s or something like that. And the data model that they preferred to implement at that time, or preferred to standardize at that time, was called the network data model, right? So today we basically talk about NoSQL and non-relational systems, etc. In fact, the data platforms, once they first got started, were actually completely non-relational. If you basically had an employee object and a department object, right? Literally there was a pointer between employee object and the department object. And then from employee 1 to employee 2, there was another pointer, right? Things like that. The way we think about databases today did not exist before 1970s, right? 1975 or 74, 75 was actually the turning point in the database history. And it is so prevalent now that, I mean, it was such a great idea in 1974, 75 that it is still being used today. How many technical ideas actually have this kind of lifespan, right? So the whole relational database machines or relational database models actually came up as a research in IBM by a computer scientist called E.F. Codd. He wrote a paper in 1970, 1969, 70, I forget exact year, 1970, I think, called Relational Model of Data. Relational algebra, which is, treating, not treating data, but in terms of a field of mathematics, actually existed for quite a long time before that, but it was sort of a niche area of study. That it can be applied to data and data manipulation was basically the primary contribution of this E.F. Codd's paper, right? And as a result of that research, in IBM, in 1974, 75, they were working on an experimental data platform based on the relational algebra called System R. Okay, so the paper that you see here, the history and evolution of System R, I think is published around 1976 or something like that. But that was the experimental database system. All the things that you today see in relational database system had their origins in this paper. It's a great paper. It's actually recommended reading material for introduction to databases in most of the universities. If you have not read it, it's actually a great read to see how people were thinking at that time, right? The model was fairly new, right? So as a result of that, basically what we saw is the emergence of a standard language based on the relational algebra and the relational database model, and it came to be known as the structured query language, right? One of the common misconceptions is that SQL, or as it is called SQL, actually exactly implements the relational algebra as it was put forward by E.F. Codd. That is absolutely not true. Really, the relational database model was based on very few primitives which could be applied to a lot of data manipulation use cases, right? Simple things such as selections, projections, joins, that basically became the very powerful primitives in which a lot of data operations could be implemented. If you see that paper, a lot of the discussions about how the relational model has to be implemented in case of disk-based systems in particular, that's what was most common at that time, which was basically disk-based systems. And so B-trees and such data structures, those are all discussed in that paper, in the System R paper, okay? And obviously, even if IBM is the one that did most of the innovation in terms of implementing System R and implementing the relational database model, really the one who made the most money out of this relational database market is this company, which you might be familiar with, right? And in fact, they were so enamored with the relational database that even their buildings have that icon that typically people tend to use for representing databases in a flowchart, right? Okay, so this was, I would say, 2000. In 2000, Oracle had 70% of the data market share. Data market share. I'm not saying the database market share, right? Data market share. Today, fast forward 15 years, and this is from 2014, this is what you see is the database technology map, right? There are something like 140 different data products. They cannot call themselves relational database management systems, but the data products that exist in the market today, or as in existed at that time, 2014. Different genres of data platforms, you can basically see, general purpose, analytical specialists, databases as a service, NoSQL extensions, big tables, all those kinds of things, right? 114 different data sets. And that is not even close to when you actually see the big data landscape of 2016. So, show of hands, how many of you can you, how many of these can you actually recognize? Between 1 to 10. All right, that's actually such a small logo that you won't be able to recognize. But think about this: one database company having 70% of the entire data market share, right? To getting to this stage where everybody now thinks that they can get the market share, they can grow to where Oracle is, right? So something must have changed in these last 15 years. So what changed? So when I look at the history of, or what happened in the last 15 years, that actually I remember very vividly, right? A few things really changed in the world that made this proliferation of data platforms possible. The first thing is that from 2000 on to 2016, in fact, the first half of 2000 to 2016, actually something called Web 2.0 emerged. Some of you might have actually seen the old Yahoo site, static links. You basically had to click on something, you didn't get notifications, pop-ups, all these things. That was the Web 1.0. In Web 2.0, you can actually basically see, web became an interactive platform. And it became an interactive platform. The new business models emerged which were advertising driven, mainly click advertising rather than display advertising, which basically meant that you have to, this became imperative for these ad-driven business models that these companies had to serve ads which the users, their users, their customers are going to click, which basically meant that they needed to understand what their users were doing. They needed to understand their users' interest. And how do they understand their users' interest? By analyzing their users' behaviors on their websites, right? This was back in 2000, right? So Web 2.0 essentially proliferated this whole data-driven websites and data analytic, that basically meant that you had to analyze this data, all these data that you collect about the users. The second thing that happened, of course, 2006 onwards is mobile, smartphones, right? Now everybody in the world is basically announcing to the rest of the world where they are, right? What they ate in the morning, right? I mean, that's probably a social networking effect. So what they ate in the morning, where they are going right now, so all that data is now constantly being generated. These days we hear a lot about industrial Internet of Things. So as the previous generation of internet actually connected multiple people together using social networking, using internet connectivity, the vision is that the various parts of a single machine will be able to talk to each other via some sort of a network, right? And obviously, when you are talking to somebody else, you are generating this data in order to, and the idea is that we'll analyze this data in order to make all sorts of, future projections about when that machine is going to die, when that machine is going to require maintenance, etc., predictive maintenance, all these things, right? So that's the other thing. So in short, what happened in the last 15 years is commonly referred to as big data. The whole big data phenomenon basically started working. And to propel this big data phenomenon and make it really popular, I think we should not forget the contribution of this whole open source movement that happened. Today, if you basically mention somebody, mention just big data to somebody, the first thing that used to come, at least 5 years ago, was Hadoop, right? And Hadoop, when I say Hadoop, it's actually a wrong pronunciation of Hadoop. It should be Apache Hadoop, right? Apache Software Foundation probably hosts something like 40 different Apache projects that are in the area of big data. Apache Software Foundation started with just one product or one project called HTTP Daemon. Now today there are 300 different, probably around 300 different projects, and 40, 50 of them are actually just focused on big data, right? The second thing that happened, and this is in the last 10 years, is the whole emergence of even the term cloud computing, right? We'll see how that actually impacted the infrastructure and how that impacted in particular the data platform later. However, I think cloud computing has had a huge impact on our day-to-day software development activities, software deployment, installation, everything has changed in the last 10 years, right? And as a result, the four horsemen that we basically see of this new era are Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook, right? We basically see a lot of the internal systems that these four companies built. There have been prototypes of those systems or implementations or clones of those systems in the open source world, right? Anytime there is a Google paper or Google publishes any of those papers, wait for 2 years and you will have an open source implementation of that. Okay? So these are essentially the guiding forces for the data infrastructure. So if you want to see where the data infrastructure is going for the general audience, I think we need to see what these four companies are doing. Obviously, just highlighting these four companies, it's actually going to be, there are a lot more companies that are doing a lot of interesting work, but majority of the advances in the data infrastructure in the last decade or so have actually come from these four companies. Okay, let's pause a while we switch the projectors. This gives us an opportunity to think a little bit about what I've said before, because right now what we are going to do is basically move into this new era that I call, sort of the turning point was from 2000 or 2002, I should say, all the way up to today, which is basically now known as, in the data platforms, as the big data era, right? I mean, let's not even talk about why this is called big data, etc. This is a typical marketing terms, it's completely meaningless to me at least, right? So, so let's basically talk about before this was even called big data, right? Around 2000, or I would say late 90s, in fact, a split happened in this whole relational database world, right? And this split was essentially in terms of the kind of workloads that you would typically run using these relational databases, right? And these came to be known as online transactional processing, or OLTP, and online analytical processing called OLAP, right? So for short, it's basically OLTP and OLAP split, right? Before this, before this split happened, there was only one type of a relational database system that you could actually just, throw some SQL queries at it. You could, what used to be called as the CRUD workloads, or CRUD, which basically meant create, read, update, and delete, right? These are the 4 essential operations that you could do on top of that, right? And that worked for quite a long time, that using this a single relational database system to do both these kinds of CRUD workloads and the kinds of reporting and business intelligence workloads. Because if you went to a bank before 2000, let's say, right, or maybe even I would say 90s, right? In that case, the bank used to be open from, let's say, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., right? That's where all the transactions were coming into the bank. After that, what was the database doing after that? Nothing. There were no transactions coming after 5 p.m., right? So all that downtime for the database, that was being used for generating nightly reports or quarterly reports or all these things. That basically meant that, let me go over all the data that is there in the database, and these are basically, and analyze this data, right? Analytical workloads, right? Rather than doing a single account update and single account withdrawals, you're basically, okay, let me analyze all the accounts. Let me analyze whatever activities happened in the last day, last month, last quarter, right? So that worked well, because the relational part or the CRUD part of the workload was only limited to 8 hours a day, and you had remaining 16 hours of day free in order to run these batch-oriented, scan-oriented analytical workload on the same database. So you could share the same database to do both kinds of workloads. Once the whole Web 2.0 thing happened, everything started getting online, which basically meant that your users were no longer logging in only from, or no longer accessing your database only from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. It was on 24/7, right? Which basically meant that there was no sort of set aside time in which you could do analytical processing on the same database. If you're doing analytical processing on the same database, your the standard relational transactional workloads would get really, really slow. And obviously you would start getting timeouts and things like that, which was a bad user experience, right? So that is the reason, in my opinion, the major split happened, where basically people decided that my transactional workloads are going to be run in a separate database, and my analytical workloads are going to be run in a separate database, right? If there are these two different kinds of workloads, I'm obviously going to design a database which is most suitable for one particular type of workload, right? So the DB2s and the SQL servers and the Oracles of the world basically still focused on the OLTP, as well as what is to be called the operational data store, or ODS, those kinds of workloads. These are low latency, highly concurrent transactional workloads working on highly structured data. The new kinds of databases were born, and these were basically mostly implemented in a massively parallel processing scale-out kind of manner. Teradata, Netezza, Vertica, Greenplum, these kinds of databases. These were optimized and really implemented from ground up for analytical processing. Analytical processing tends to have very low number of updates and very large number of reads. So because the transactional data is coming in once a day from your transactional database systems into the analytical database system, and then that data gets repeatedly analyzed. So high read to update ratio. Whereas the transactional workloads typically are about 50-50, 50% reads, 50% updates, right? So the data processing that used to happen, that used to be business internal, first of all. This would generate reports that would be consumed by the internal business itself. Your entire bank's, I'm taking just bank just as an example, your entire bank's financial analytics was not exposed to your end user. The end user only could see his or her own database, right? Own account. That's pretty much it, right? So this was for business internal purposes, and the access patterns were completely different, right? So we basically, in around 2004, 2005, we basically saw that these split was now complete, right? In fact, Oracle, when they wanted to get into the analytical database, they essentially designed something not for ground up, but essentially repurposed their Oracle RDBMS as Exadata, which was an analytical database. So even Oracle basically got into the analytical database market with another product of their own, right? So the OLTP and OLAP split was complete in around 2004, 2005, right? However, this MPP part, which is massively parallel processing part, right? That was still running on a single tightly controlled appliance or a cluster of machines that was managed as a whole by one IT organization. Now, when we basically saw that every business is becoming global, which basically meant their data infrastructure is now globally distributed. Now it's very loosely coupled rather than tightly coupled, as in this case, right? People started thinking about how would I implement a data infrastructure in a globally distributed environment, right? And obviously, people started doing or at least started attempts to do that, and unfortunately came across a fundamental limitation that was initially called Brewer's conjecture. Eric Brewer was a professor in Berkeley who founded a company called Ink2Me, one of the first parallel search engines, came up with this conjecture in 1999. And what it said, and it was actually proven by Nancy Lynch and Seth Gilbert of MIT in 2002 as a theorem. So what it says is that if there are three desirable properties of a data environment or of a data system, right? Consistency, which means everybody reads the same thing, right? Availability, which basically means when you make a request to the data system, either it tells you that it's successful, returns results saying that it's successful, or it actually says that it has failed, right? That's what availability means. And the third one is partition tolerance, which basically means that if you have a geographically distributed system and if there is a network partition, which basically means one part of the system is not reachable from other part of the system, then the system should still continue to function. Those are the three most desirable properties in a distributed environment, right? So what CAP theorem says is basically you can have at most two of these three. You cannot, it is impossible to have all these three simultaneously, right? Which basically means that you cannot implement a distributed system, a distributed database that has all these three: consistency, availability, and partition tolerance, right? So essentially now you have a trade-off. You basically can say, my data system, my data platform is either going to be available 24/7 and be network partition tolerant, but then it cannot offer consistent results. If there are two clients requesting the same data, they may not get the same result, right? So that's one trade-off. So essentially ignoring each one of them, so ignoring consistency, ignoring availability, and ignoring partition tolerance essentially results in three different kinds of data systems, right? And most of the time, people want their data systems to be available. So availability is something that you cannot really ignore, right? People want, and especially for the web scale, people want their systems to be partition tolerant because networks go down, networks again reconnect, and the whole partitioning actually appears in various forms, right? So most commonly, what is ignored in this case, in these data systems, is consistency, okay? And that is what resulted in this whole NoSQL movement, right? Again, like other marketing terms such as big data, NoSQL is completely meaningless marketing term, right? Probably when it came in, it was, okay, we don't have a SQL access to this data platform, sure. But if you look at today, out of those 140 different NoSQL system, probably 120 already have SQL access. So NoSQL clearly has no meaning, right? So what happened then is basically just a sort of a renaissance that everybody's imagination started flowing, saying that, hey, now I don't have to be bound by imposing this transactionality or relational model, I can actually build my own database. And every Tom, Dick, and Harry essentially build their own NoSQL database, right? So now what we have seen is a proliferation of data systems that resulted in key value stores, such as Voldemort, React, whatever, wide column or column family store, where each of these rows in the database is a collection of thousands of columns, thousands of attributes. Most of them are going to be absent from each row. We have seen document stores like MongoDB. We have seen graph stores, time series stores, right? Literally what happened, I mean, the only thing that I can find common across all these things, first of all, CAP theorem was the guiding principle behind each one of them. But the second thing, really, this whole NoSQL movement is essentially deconstruction of a database. When you see Oracle, when you see DB2, when you see SQL Server or System R or whatever, right? Each and every component was vertically integrated in a single data system, right? What the NoSQL movement allowed us to do is deconstruct this entire end-to-end system into multiple components, okay? Where have we seen this happening very recently? I don't know whether you have seen this picture or not. This is actually an eye-opening picture. It's all these startup logos are overlapped or superimposed on a bank's homepage. Wells Fargo is the name of the bank. Take their homepage, and if you look at every feature that their Wells Fargo bank's page has, there are startups that are attacking that particular part of that business. So in banking, like in many industries that you see, the vertically integrated part of the end-to-end financial services bank is gone, because now there are 300 startups competing for specific features or specific things that a bank offers. Really think about this and how the NoSQL movement, I mean, this is a parallel between the bank and the financial services and the database industry as a NoSQL movement, right? Typically, what are the components of a database system? You would see there is an admission control access layer, then there is a query engine, there is a storage engine, there are a bunch of utilities that allow you to do replication, backup, recovery, etc., right? In the NoSQL world, in the new NoSQL world, in the old database world, all these would be offered by a single system, right? In the new NoSQL world, what people are doing is building this part, which is best of breed, this part, which is another component, which is a completely independent system, another best of breed. So literally the deconstruction of the database is basically what happened in the NoSQL era, okay? So I will obviously talk about, one of the things that came out as NoSQL, obviously because it did not have a SQL query engine at that point. And MapReduce was the only framework that actually programmatically could query the data inside of that. So one of the Hadoop distributions is basically here. This was in 2013. Those were the good days, three years of a very simple Hadoop distribution. You had a few access methods, you had a few file systems, you had a few workflow platforms, etc., right? Today, if you look at the Hadoop components of a typical Hadoop distribution, people actually had to create a periodic table in order to denote each one of those components. So look at more than 40 components in a particular Hadoop distribution, right? And obviously, if it were exactly this that you would get from year to year to year, that would be okay. But this is another one that basically shows these are all the Hadoop components of a Hadoop distribution, and the number of version changes that happen across. This is one distribution, 3 versions of one Hadoop distributions, which is the Hortonworks data platform. From one version to another, more than half of the versions change with incompatible changes and things like that. So it has become basically a nightmare right now, building Hadoop distributions and building on top of Hadoop distributions, right? So this is where we are today, okay? Obviously, the Hadoop distributions have to sell their Hadoop distributions to the enterprises, so they basically came up with other meaningless marketing terms, and one of those meaningless marketing terms is called a data lake, okay? So what the data lake proponents tell you, first gather all the data. Wherever the data is located, whether it is within your company or it's on a website loaded somewhere, first gather all the data, Okay, there were public data sets, social media data. You can buy social media data from somewhere else. You can subscribe to Twitter feed. All this data, first get it inside, and then somehow they say that, okay, then magic happens. Now you are in big data. Obviously, that data is just lying there. You can't really do anything, right? Just by storing this data. How do you take advantage of this data? Obviously, by doing analytics. And what is analytics? Analytics is another overused term, right? People assign different meanings to the term analytics. But really, the meaning is deriving context from data. Context is a function of data, and deriving from this data the context, that's what analytics really means. Okay? So the second aspect of this is the time value of data, right? And this is again not something that I'm making up as a chart. This actually came from TIBCO, Spotfire. I believe they are in this building somewhere. But so that was in 2013. And this was really based on quantification of when the data is generated versus when the data is interpreted, how much is the value, business value that is lost if the data is analyzed or action taken upon that data is way further away from when the data was generated, right? A very simple thing to think about, right? If something happened, you have a heart attack, right? I hope you don't, but if you have a heart attack, right? And then 3 days later, the ambulance comes and basically says, did somebody have a heart attack here? Obviously, it has absolutely no value, right? From the time that event happened to the action taken, the amount of time has to be less and less. Only then that is really meaningful. Otherwise, you lose all the data there, right? So now, based on the previous slide, it was basically analytics was deriving context from all this data. Obviously, the decision that you are or action that you are going to be taking on this data is based on that deriving that context. So what really means is that the real-time context, and again, real-time, I really apologize, this is another meaningless term that is just a marketing term. What does real-time really mean, right? If you have that context when you need it, that's real-time, sure, right? But people tend to use real-time to be like fast or something like that, right? It does not really mean that. Okay. Anyway, so real-time context, I mean, I'm still using the marketing term, but real-time context is more important than historical context. Historical context is important. Again, giving the example of heart attack, if you are having a heart attack, knowing that you have had a heart attack 3 years ago is important, right? But really, what is more important is that knowing that today right now you are having a heart attack. That's all I mean by that, right? And obviously with this understanding, I mean, this is again, we are not alone here that to come to know of this. With this understanding, which basically says deriving the context from data in the shortest amount of time is much more important than deriving historical context, we see that 73% of the organizations are today investing in real-time data platforms. Again, marketing term, sorry, real-time data platforms, right? But really, if we were to expand to that, why are people doing this? And this is where we are going towards the next generation workloads and what are the emerging data architectures that can satisfy these workloads, right? Really what the enterprises are doing, again, more marketing words, but at least these are sort of more meaningful marketing words. They are hyper-personalizing applications, which basically means the application behavior is personalized for the user that is using that application. That's what I mean by literally a audience of one is what I'm talking about, right? So hyper-personalizing applications, how are they doing it? They are using predictive analytics based on your previous behavior, your interaction with not only that application, but maybe your location information, and in general, the context, the real-time context that you can gather from your behavior. So that's basically where predictive analytics is coming in. And obviously, this analytics is driven by high-velocity big data. So when you said big data, right, Gartner came up with this nice definition of big data saying volume, velocity, and variety. Most of the time, people, when they talk about big data and this, the whole Hadoop platforms, they refer to volume, okay? The variety and volume and variety in particular, because the whole unstructured and semi-structured aspect of it. However, velocity is was so far often forgotten, right? So really, in order to derive the context of data as soon as possible, you are now interested more in high velocity rather than the other two aspects of volume and variety. Okay? So that's basically where I see that all the next generation workloads in the data platforms coming from hyper-personalization of apps, predictive analytics, and high velocity data. Okay? So as a result, now I'm moving to my advertising, my pitch of Ampool as to why we decided to build Ampool based on this, right? We basically see, and I come from Pivotal. Until last year, I used to work at Pivotal, which has Cloud Foundry and Pivotal Labs as agile application development methodologies and deployment methodologies, right? That's on the left-hand side. That people have understood pretty well. How to incorporate user feedbacks into doing agile development, continuous deployment, continuous integration, all these things, getting new versions of the applications constantly refreshed and deployed and made available to the users. That's the left-hand side. That's going on pretty well, right? Unfortunately, the problem lies on the right-hand side of the data, right? When you are taking all the data that these applications are producing and you now want to analyze this data, it has to go through multiple phases. There is a data ingestion phase, there is ETL, extract, transform, load, which is combining all the data sets into a coherent set of data, and then exploring this data, generating BI and report, finally doing predictive analytics on part of that. And by the way, what happens after predictive models? Well, these models are just lying there. How do you get these models back into the applications so that applications can tune themselves? There is a big wall there, right? That's the wall we want to break. Now, obviously, the Web 2.0 companies, the Googles, the Twitters, the LinkedIns, the Facebooks of the world, they have noticed this problem long time ago, before the traditional enterprises actually even started thinking about that. And their enterprising people there, researchers there, proposed something called Lambda architecture, right? So what the Lambda architecture means, and this is current vogue, right? I mean, that basically says, anytime you basically come up with this problem, there will be some data architect somewhere that basically says, why aren't you using Lambda architecture, right? So that's sort of the go-to architecture for these kinds of use cases now. What the Lambda architecture says is basically take all the data sources that you have and replicate these data sources into multiple layers or the multiple platforms. One that does streaming, does not store any data. As the data comes in a small batches of windows or a small batches of data, takes some action on top of that. And most of the time, the results of that are going to be inaccurate. I mean, they are not going to be exact. They are going to be approximate, and they are good enough, right? But the second thing, when you actually want to do large-scale analysis and want exact results, then you have to access all that data, put that in the batch computation layer, and this is where Hadoop comes in. You put all that data in HDFS or something like that and launch Hive, MapReduce, all these queries in the batch layer. Combine both of these results in some sort of a database which can be queried from applications, right? Now the challenge with implementing this Lambda architecture is essentially that a single bit of data lands in three different places, okay? One is in streaming layer, the another one is in batch layer, and the third one is in the query layer, right? So if you are implementing any governance, data governance on top of all these data, it has to be replicated 3 times. Now replicated 3 times is okay, but the problem is getting that data from the data source to actually making it available to the application. You essentially have to follow these 3 paths, right? And most of the time in these Lambda architecture based pipelines is going to be copying this data from one place to another, right? You can make that really efficient by devoting a lot of resources on that, a lot of operations staff in order to maintain these huge clusters, implementing these 3 different systems, but essentially this is 3 times the cost that you have to incur, right? Okay, so this is the problem we intend to solve at Ampool, right? We take this right-hand side, which is a data pipeline that basically says, you know, we are getting this data, do this particular operation on that, take the result of that, push it into this data lake. Pull it back from the data lake, do another operation on that, push the results of that operation back into the data lake, right? So that broken loop basically the problems, the efficiencies, where the efficiencies are lost is essentially a lot of file-based data exchange happens in implementing these data pipelines. A lot of file format conversions, because there are a bunch of file, I mean, the simplest file format is CSV, right? But if you ever export something from Excel and want to run another, import it into another data platform, most often you will basically see, okay, the strings are not quoted, \n, what happens if \n appears inside of one of the fields? All hell breaks loose, right? Even with a single format called CSV. There are at least 40 different formats that are being used in this whole big data world. So you have to keep on converting between one file format to another one. That loses a lot of efficiency. Most of these data lakes being distributed file systems which are immutable basically means you cannot modify anything in place. If you have to make a simple modification, let's say you have a user's name there and you want to capitalize the first letter of the name. You essentially have to create another copy of that with the capitalization of the first name. You cannot modify things in place, right? So you create a lots of copies there. And obviously, because it's a file system, everything that you are doing has to be serialized into a stream of bytes and deserialized from a stream of bytes. So that serialization, deserialization overheads essentially takes over. And because it's a disk-based systems, it's inherently has a lack of multi-tenancy. Basically, if you have ever looked at a hard disk up close, there is a mechanical arm that goes around like this. When multiple users are trying to access different areas on the disk, that arm is the first one that melts, literally, right? So inherently, the disk-based systems are not designed for multi-tenancy, okay? So that's how we basically got into this business of solving that problem in particular, that whole file-based data exchange problem. So I'm not going to probably, running out of time, but not going to do too much of advertising of Ampool, but literally bridging that gap in this data pipelines by eliminating this whole file-based data exchange and eliminating most of the serialization and deserialization by providing an in-memory layer on this data lake is basically what we are doing. And we hope that with this implementation, you will be able to connect that left-hand side loop of applications and the right-hand side loop of data processing by taking the data exhaust, streaming it through this data pipeline as fast as possible, generating predictive models, and push these predictive models back into the applications so that applications can self-tune. That's basically the vision, right? Now, obviously, you're saying, sure, but all this you're saying has to be done pretty fast. It has to be multi-tenant, etc. Therefore, it has to be in memory. And memory is expensive. How much memory are you going to have? I won't be able to put a lot of data in memory because even in this laptop, I basically have 256 gigabytes of disk, but the amount of memory is only 8 gigabytes, right? All I'm going to hold in this 8 gigabytes is 8 gigabytes of data, whereas my disk-based platforms are multiple terabytes, right? So you're going to be analyzing very small amount of data. Well, fortunately, what we see is that the technology trends are such that we are going to get more and more of these memory-like storage system in our computers pretty soon, okay? So a few technology trends that I want to highlight, which are going to influence these new emerging architectures. The first is on the software and the deployment side, right? And the compute infrastructure side in general. Public and private clouds are here to stay. They are all scale out. They are all on-demand compute infrastructures. That's going to compute, storage, networking. That's going to remain. Software development methodologies, ever since we basically have, sort of moved away from these heavyweight virtualizations into more containerized applications and microservices and orchestration and containerization now separated, right? I mean, so this is, I think, we are going in the right direction. And the data, currently that is being used most commonly for the application deployment, the application development. However, we will start seeing that being used in the data platforms themselves. Currently, the data or the data platforms of the past were mostly monolithic deployments. A single monolith was thrown at you, and basically you started using that. More and more of these data platforms are going to be containerized, and the orchestration is going to be separated from the containerization. The second thing that we basically see inside a single machine itself is the memory bandwidth and the I/O bandwidth, what used to be called as the FSB, the front side bus, or the north layer and the south layer of a chip, huge difference in speeds in between the memory bandwidths and the I/O bandwidths. I/O bandwidths have been stuck at few gigabytes per second for quite a long time. Memory bandwidths have gone to hundreds or tens of gigabytes per second now, right? So that's huge. The second thing is that the network bandwidth has increased tremendously, right? When Google basically started building their first scale-out infrastructure back in '99, the entire data center basically had a bandwidth of about 100 megabits per second, cross-sectional bandwidth, 100 megabits per second, okay? Today, if you go to Google data centers, if you go to Facebook data center, they have 100 gigabits, 1,000 times increase in the last 15 years itself. Okay, that's the cross-sectional bandwidth within their clusters, right? So that's from the throughput side. The third thing that we have basically seen is in the last 10 years, the solid-state storage, rather than the magnetic storage, the solid-state storage has plummeted, the cost of that has plummeted a lot, right? I mean, it's basically literally it started with tens of dollars per gigabyte. Now it is basically getting into $1 per gigabyte, and soon it will be comparable to the hard disk drive by 2019. Also, in the last few years, we have actually seen the emergence of what is now called as the storage class memory. It's almost as fast as the dynamic random access memory, DRAM. However, unlike DRAM, which basically loses data if the power is turned off, it actually is persistent. So once you write something on it, it actually stays there even if the power is turned off, right? So a lot of these examples are 3D XPoint from Intel and Micron, PCM and MRAM from IBM and Toshiba, Memristor from HP. They are going to be generally available next year, early next year. 3D XPoint is actually already available, right? And the non-volatile DIMMs, which are the memory modules that incorporate some of these new technologies, they are now supported by all the major OSs. Thankfully, there are only 3 now, Mac OS X, Linux, and Windows. So they all of them support that. And what these offer is 10 times more density. What you could pack, I mean, on a single DIMM, you could pack only about 64 gigabits today. With these NVDIMMs, you are able to pack almost a terabyte of data on the single DIMM, right? And at 1/5 the cost of per gigabyte DRAM. So literally, whatever is not contained in memory today, because of the lack of, the memory size, in the next 5 years, that and much more will actually reside in memory. And by memory, I mean most of the time this NVDIMMs, right? So just to quickly show you, some graphs that are projecting how fast the memory bandwidth is growing. And by the way, this is the disk bandwidth. It is almost saturated. No hopes of getting it beyond 200 megabytes per second, right? You have seen a lot of these non-volatile DIMMs. Basically, see a bunch of DRAM chips there and bunch of flash chips there, and the new storage class memory has come into picture. You basically go from tape to L1 cache, which remains in CPU. There was a huge gap in between SSDs and DRAM, and these new storage class memory is actually filling that gap, right? Price obviously is going to be different, but if you look at the price performance ratio, the two kinds of workloads that I talked about, one is the OLTP and one is the OLAP workload. The OLTP workload, which is the transactional workload, is actually characterized by how many IOPS, how many IO operations per second you can do. And the OLAP workloads, which are the analytical workloads, are basically how many gigabytes per second can you read and write, right? That's a throughput-oriented workload. So if you basically take these costs per gigabyte and this performance and basically say, what is my price performance ratio? Really, for analytical workloads, DRAM is still the best and will remain the best. You can basically say now, this is gigabytes per bandwidth per cost of storage divided by the cost of storage, right? So taking that into account, DRAM is the right system for doing analytical workloads. However, when you consider the IOPS kind of workload, the transactional workloads, which is 4 kilobytes IO operations per second, then the best one is actually this new storage class memory that is coming up, right? So a system that is composed, a data system that is composed of these two storage types is going to dominate and is going to be the most cost effective for these emerging workloads, right? And that is where you would see a lot of these emerging data systems, including Ampool, working on. Okay, so I think we are. I've taken a lot of your time. I would like to take questions for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have the second talk.